Flashing survey flags weren't supposed to appear in my backyard before sunrise, especially not planted past the old granite stones my grandfather set there 40 years ago. Yet when I pulled the curtains, orange ribbons snapped in the wind like warning flares, marking a line that didn't belong. By noon, contractors were measuring, neighbors were whispering, and the HOA president was smiling as if a quiet victory had already been won. They thought those stones were decorative relics. They were wrong. I walked outside barefoot, dew soaking my steps, and stood over the first marker. It was smooth from decades of rain, its edge chipped where my childhood bike once scraped it. My grandfather had called them truth stones. He placed them after a professional survey, lining the boundary with stubborn care. Land remembers, he used to say. You just have to know where to look. The workers didn't pause when I asked what they were doing. One of them pointed toward the street where a clipboard rested on a car hood. HOA expansion project, he said. We're clearing space for a walking path along this side. His finger traced a route that sliced straight through my flower beds, past the maple tree, and into what they believed was common ground. I followed his finger back to the stones. That's my property, I said calmly. He shrugged. We go by the map they gave us. By afternoon, a temporary fence appeared, thin metal stakes pressed into soil that had never belonged to anyone but my family. Neighbors gathered in quiet clusters, watching like it was a show they didn't want tickets for. Some looked sympathetic. Others avoided eye contact. Everyone knew the HOA didn't make mistakes. At least, that's what they believed. I took photos. Of the stones. Of the flags. Of the fence. Then I went inside and pulled out a dusty folder from the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside were yellowed documents, survey diagrams, and a deed with a hand-drawn boundary line that matched the stones perfectly. The map the HOA used was newer. Cleaner. Digitized. And completely wrong. That evening, I emailed the HOA with copies of everything. The response came quickly and confidently. Their records showed the land was part of the community easement. The stones, they wrote, were likely ornamental. Ornamental. I stared at the word for a long time. Those stones had stood longer than most board members had lived here. They had outlasted repainting projects, landscaping trends, and leadership changes. But now, suddenly, they were decoration. By sunset, the fence was still there. The flags were still snapping. And the path they planned was cutting straight through my history. They thought the stones were meaningless. I knew they were evidence. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the orange flag slicing through my garden like bright little insults. By morning, the temporary fence had settled into the soil as if it had always been there, a thin metallic claim over ground that had never been questioned before. Neighbors passed by more slowly than usual on their morning walks. Some glanced toward my yard with curiosity. Others avoided looking altogether, as if witnessing a boundary dispute might somehow involve them. I understood the silence. The HOA had a way of making people feel like resistance was pointless. But I wasn't resisting out of pride. I was resisting out of certainty. After coffee, I took the folder of documents and drove to the county records office. The building smelled faintly of paper and polish, the kind of place where time felt slower and more permanent. A clerk listened patiently as I explained the situation, then pulled up archived maps on a large screen. We compared the original survey from 40 years ago with the HOA's modern version. The difference was subtle but critical. At some point during a digital update years back, the boundary line had shifted several feet inward. Just enough to swallow the strip of land where my grandfather's stones stood. Not dramatically wrong. Just inaccurately convenient. The clerk leaned closer to the screen. This happens more than people realize, she said quietly. Old markers get ignored when new maps are drawn from satellite data instead of ground surveys. Ignored. That word stayed with me. I requested certified copies of the original survey and the updated map showing the discrepancy. The clerk stamped each page with slow, deliberate movements, as if adding weight to my argument with every thud of ink. When I returned home, 2 HOA board members were standing near the fence, speaking with one of the contractors. They stopped talking when they saw me. Their smiles were polite but strained, the kind people use when they believe a misunderstanding will soon be cleared up in their favor. I walked straight to the stones and placed the documents on top of one. "These match the original deed," I said calmly. "Your map doesn't." They glanced at the papers but didn't bend down to read them. "Our records are up to date," one replied. "We've already approved the path installation." I looked at the fence, then at the stones, then back at them. For the first time, I realized they weren't questioning the facts. They were trusting the system that produced them. And the system was wrong. The contractors resumed measuring, their tapes stretching across soil that had just been proven mine on paper. The board members nodded to each other, confident in procedure, not accuracy. I understood something important in that moment. This wasn't going to be solved with a single email. By the third morning, the orange flags had multiplied. They lined up like silent witnesses along the edge of my yard, marking a future that still didn't belong to the HOA no matter how confidently they planned it. I stood at the window with a mug of untouched tea, watching a small crew unload wooden planks from a truck. The walking path was no longer an idea. It was becoming lumber and nails. I stepped outside before they could begin. "Please wait," I said, holding up the certified copies from the county office. "This land is not part of the easement. The original survey proves it." The foreman scratched his beard and studied the papers with more interest than the board members had shown. He frowned slightly. "You should talk to the HOA," he said. "We just follow orders." "I have talked to them." He gave me a sympathetic look, the kind reserved for people caught between paperwork and reality. Then he walked back to his crew and told them to hold for a few minutes. That pause felt like a tiny victory. I called the HOA president directly. This time, my voice was steady. I explained the discrepancy again, mentioned the county clerk, the original deed, the stamped copies. There was a long silence on the other end before she replied. "We'll review it," she said. "But the project can't be delayed based on one homeowner's documents." One homeowner's documents. I looked down at the stones. They had been placed before this neighborhood even had an HOA. Before the paved sidewalks. Before the decorative street lamps. Yet somehow, they were being treated like an inconvenience to progress. I did the only thing left that felt logical. I called a licensed surveyor. By afternoon, a man in a white hat arrived with measuring equipment that looked far more serious than tape measures and orange flags. He introduced himself calmly, walked the length of my yard, and asked about the stones. My grandfather placed them after a professional survey in the 1980s, I told him. He smiled slightly. "Then we're probably going to agree." For the next 2 hours, he measured, calculated, and checked coordinates against archived county data. The contractors waited awkwardly beside their truck. A few neighbors gathered again, drawn by the unusual sight of someone questioning the HOA certainty. Finally, the surveyor placed a small marker exactly beside the first granite stone. "This," he said clearly, "is the legal boundary." And it was several feet outside the line where the HOA planned their path. I felt a calm spread through me that no argument had given before. Not because I had won. But because the truth was now standing in my yard wearing a reflective vest. The surveyor handed me a preliminary report and promised a formal version by morning. The workers packed up their tools without being told. For the first time, the orange flags looked uncertain. The formal survey report arrived by email at 8:03 a.m., stamped, signed, and impossible to misread. A clean diagram showed the true boundary line running precisely along the granite stones, just as my grandfather had intended. Measurements were listed down to the inch. Coordinates matched the county archive. There was no gray area left for interpretation. I printed 3 copies. By the time I stepped outside, 2 HOA board members were already near the fence, speaking in low voices while looking at their phones. Word had clearly traveled. The surveyor's visit the previous afternoon hadn't gone unnoticed. I walked toward them and handed over the first copy without saying a word. They read it slowly this time. One of them adjusted his glasses and traced the diagram with his finger. The other glanced toward the stones, then back at the paper, then toward the partially marked path. For the first time since this began, they weren't standing with quiet authority. They were standing with visible doubt. "This contradicts our map," one said. "It corrects your map," I replied gently. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered again, pretending not to listen while very clearly listening. The orange flags still lined the yard, but now they looked less like markers and more like mistakes waiting to be removed. The HOA president arrived 15 minutes later, walking faster than usual. She greeted no one. She went straight for the survey report, read it once, then read it again. Her jaw tightened slightly. "We'll need to verify this," she said. "With what?" I asked calmly. "Another digital map." She didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the first granite stone and crouched beside it. She brushed dirt away from its edge as if seeing it for the first time. The stone didn't look ornamental now. It looked deliberate. Permanent. The contractors remained by their truck, watching quietly. No one resumed work. After a long pause, the president stood up and faced the group. "All construction is paused until further notice," she announced. A murmur moved through the neighbors like a breeze through leaves. Not loud, but unmistakable. The flags still fluttered in the wind, but the confidence behind them had vanished. As the board members left, I noticed something subtle. They weren't looking at me with annoyance anymore. They were looking at the ground, at the stones, at the space between what they believed and what was proven. And for the first time, they seemed to understand they had built a plan on top of an error. By afternoon, the orange flags were still standing, but they no longer carried authority. They looked like leftovers from a plan that had quietly unraveled. Neighbors walked past them with a different expression now, less curiosity, more realization. The story had shifted from HOA project to HOA mistake. Around 3 p.m., I received an email requesting my presence at an emergency board meeting that evening. The tone was formal but noticeably restrained. No references to violations. No mention of easements. Just a request to discuss the boundary findings. I printed the survey again and placed it neatly in a folder with the original deed and the county copies. This time, I wasn't going to explain. I was going to present. The clubhouse felt different when I walked in. The board members weren't seated behind their long table like judges. They sat scattered, papers in front of them, laptops open, looking more like students preparing for a difficult lesson. The HOA president gestured for me to sit. I didn't. She began by acknowledging the survey. Not defensively. Not dismissively. Just factually. "It appears our current digital records do not match the original ground survey from decades ago," she said. I nodded but remained silent. A board member spoke next. "We relied entirely on updated mapping software when approving the path route. We did not verify physical boundary markers." The words felt important. Verify. Physical. Markers. I placed the folder on the table and slid the deed forward. "My grandfather didn't use software," I said. "He used professionals and stone." No one argued. They passed the documents around slowly. The room was quiet except for the rustling of paper. I realized this was the first time they were truly looking at the history of the land instead of the convenience of their map. After several minutes, the president exhaled deeply. "We made an error," she said. The sentence didn't sound easy to say. She continued, "The walking path plan will be revised immediately. Your property will not be touched. And we will be reviewing all boundary data across the community to prevent this from happening again." I felt no triumph. Only a calm sense of correction settling into place. As I left the clubhouse, I noticed two neighbors waiting outside. They didn't ask what happened. They already knew by the expression on my face. Back home, the orange flags still stood in the fading light. But now, they looked temporary. Like they were waiting for someone to admit they didn't belong. The next morning, the orange flags were gone. No announcement. No ceremony. Just quiet removal, as if the HOA hoped the evidence of their mistake could be lifted from the soil as easily as the thin plastic stakes. But the faint holes in the ground remained, small reminders of where assumptions had once stood. I stepped outside early, coffee in hand, and walked the length of the granite stones. They looked exactly as they always had: steady, weathered, patient. For the first time since this began, I felt like the yard had exhaled. Around mid-morning, a pickup truck with the HOA logo parked across the street. Two board members stepped out carrying measuring equipment and printed maps. They weren't here for my property anymore. They were here to recheck everything. Neighbors noticed. One by one, people came outside under the excuse of gardening, walking dogs, or collecting mail. Curiosity had replaced indifference. The HOA wasn't directing a project now. They were verifying their own records. Daniel from 2 houses down walked over to me. "They're checking my side yard too," he said quietly. I always wondered why my fence felt slightly off. That sentence lingered with me. Slightly off. By afternoon, the board members had moved house to house, comparing digital lines with physical markers: fences, stones, old stakes half buried in soil. In several places, the same quiet discovery repeated itself. Boundaries that had shifted on screens but never moved in real life. The mistake wasn't isolated to my yard. It was systemic. Later that day, an email went out to the entire community. The subject line read, "Boundary Verification Initiative." The message explained that the HOA had identified discrepancies between digital maps and original surveys. They encouraged residents to report any physical markers or old documentation they had. Encouraged. A week ago, they had dismissed my stones as ornamental. Now, they were asking others to find theirs. By evening, neighbors were digging through garages and storage boxes, pulling out rolled-up surveys, faded property sketches, even old photographs showing fence placements from decades past. The neighborhood had turned into a quiet archive, uncovering pieces of history that had been ignored in favor of convenience. I realized something important as I watched people compare papers on their driveways. This had never been just about my boundary. It had been about trusting the ground beneath our feet more than the screen in someone's office. Within days, the neighborhood looked like a place mid-investigation. Measuring tapes stretched across lawns. Old fence lines were examined like artifacts. Neighbors who had barely exchanged greetings for years now stood together comparing documents and pointing at corners of yards they had never paid attention to before. The HOA board moved through the streets with clipboards and cautious expressions. They weren't directing anything now. They were learning. I watched from my porch as two board members stood beside Mrs. Alder's garden wall, discussing a boundary that didn't match the digital map. She brought out a brittle folder from 1992 with a survey inside that told a different story. The board members listened carefully, nodding, taking notes. This wasn't authority anymore. This was correction in motion. By midweek, another email went out. This one acknowledged that multiple properties had similar discrepancies. The wording was careful, but the message was clear: the HOA's mapping system had drifted from reality over time. Neighbors began sharing stories I had never heard. One man said he always suspected his driveway extended farther than the map showed. A couple mentioned they had once been warned about a shed placement that now appeared perfectly legal under the original survey lines. People weren't angry. They were surprised. And oddly relieved. It felt like the neighborhood was rediscovering itself, house by house, boundary by boundary. That evening, Daniel stopped by again. "You realize," he said, "if they had built that path without checking, they would have done it across at least 5 properties." I looked down the street, imagining the quiet resentment that would have followed. The confusion. The disputes. The slow erosion of trust that might have taken years to surface. All because no one questioned a map. The granite stones in my yard had done more than mark a boundary. They had interrupted a chain of assumptions before it spread further. A notice soon followed announcing a community meeting to discuss updated boundary records and new verification procedures. This time, the HOA wasn't calling the meeting to enforce something. They were calling it to explain. As the sun set that night, I walked along the stones again, brushing dirt from their edges. They felt less like relics now and more like witnesses that had finally been heard. The community meeting filled the clubhouse beyond capacity. Folding chairs lined the walls, and people stood near the doors, holding old folders, rolled papers, and printed photos like evidence brought to a quiet trial. The mood wasn't hostile. It was attentive. Curious. Ready to understand how something so small had quietly affected so many properties. The HOA president stood at the front, not behind a long table this time, but beside a projector screen showing 2 maps side by side. One was the current digital layout. The other was a composite created from original surveys residents had provided during the week. The difference was undeniable. Thin red lines showed where boundaries had shifted over time. Some were minor, only inches off. Others, like mine, were several feet misplaced. A soft murmur passed through the room as people recognized their own lots highlighted on the screen. We relied too heavily on automated updates and not enough on physical verification, the president admitted. That was our oversight. No one interrupted. No one shouted. The honesty carried more weight than any defense could have. She explained the new plan: every property line in the community would be verified against original surveys, physical markers, and, if necessary, new professional measurements. The HOA would cover the cost. Records would be corrected permanently. A hand went up in the back. What about fines people received in the past based on wrong boundaries? The room grew quiet. The president nodded. Those cases will be reviewed. Adjustments will be made where errors are found. I glanced around and saw expressions shift from curiosity to relief. Some people had clearly carried quiet frustration for years without knowing why. Then the president did something unexpected. She invited residents to share what they had found during the week. One by one, people stood up. A fence placed perfectly according to an old survey. A garden bed that had been mistakenly labeled encroachment. A driveway warning that now made no sense. Each story added another layer to the realization spreading through the room. This wasn't about blame. It was about restoring accuracy. As the meeting ended, neighbors lingered, talking in small groups, comparing notes and papers. For the first time, the HOA and the residents weren't on opposite sides of an issue. They were on the same side of the truth. A few weeks later, the neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Lawns trimmed. Mailboxes straight. Flower beds bright with early color. Nothing in passing would suggest that a quiet correction had taken place beneath the surface of Maple Ridge. But if you knew where to look, you could see it. Small survey stakes now sat discreetly beside old markers across several yards, confirming lines that had once been questioned. Updated records had been mailed to every homeowner, each one carefully reviewed against original surveys and fresh measurements. The HOA's digital map had been rebuilt from the ground up, this time following the land instead of reshaping it. The walking path project had been redesigned too. It curved gently along the true easement, avoiding private yards entirely. Workers returned one morning to begin construction again, but this time they moved with quiet precision, double-checking each measurement before placing a single board. I watched them from my porch, feeling none of the tension that had filled me weeks earlier. The path no longer felt like an invasion. It felt like something properly placed. Neighbors passed by and nodded to me more often now. Not in gratitude, but in recognition. We had all learned something together. Boundaries weren't just lines on a map. They were history, intention, and proof that the ground holds memory long after documents change. One afternoon, I found myself brushing dirt from the top of the first granite stone again. It looked the same as it always had: solid, unremarkable, easy to overlook if you didn't know its purpose. For decades, it had quietly marked truth without asking to be noticed. I thought about how close it had come to being dismissed as decoration. Inside, I placed the survey report and the original deed back into their folder, but this time I stored them somewhere easier to reach. Not out of fear. Out of awareness. Because I understood now how easily systems can drift from reality when no one checks the ground beneath them. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I walked the line of stones from one end of the yard to the other. The boundary had never moved. Only the understanding of it had. And sometimes, that is the bigger correction of all. The correction didn't end with updated maps and neatly placed stakes. It lingered in conversations that drifted across driveways at dusk and in the slower way people now walked their property lines, noticing details they had ignored for years. Awareness had settled into the neighborhood like a second layer of light. A week after the path was completed, I found a small envelope in my mailbox with no return name. Inside was a photocopy of an old survey from another street in the community, along with a handwritten note: "Found this in my attic after the meeting. Never knew what it was for. Now I do." I smiled, realizing the ripple was still moving. The HOA sent one final email summarizing the entire process. They didn't frame it as an error anymore. They framed it as a lesson in verification, history, and responsibility. The language had changed. Less authority. More humility. Daniel stopped by that evening and leaned against the porch rail. "Funny how all this started because of a few stones," he said. I shook my head gently. It started because nobody questioned a map. We stood quietly for a moment, watching the new path curve properly along the edge of the street. Children were already using it on bikes. Neighbors walked their dogs along it. It fit now. Naturally. As if it had always belonged there. And that was the difference. The project hadn't been wrong. The placement had.
Later that night, I stepped into the yard one last time before heading inside. The air was still, the stones were cool under my fingers. I realized they had never needed defending, they had only needed to be acknowledged for the seeds they had marked truth patiently while the world around them changed. In the end, the Hoa didn't ignore my boundary stones out of my malice. They ignored them because they trusted convince over confirmation, and that is a mistake for either to make. Then people realize, but once seen, it is impossible to forget. The stone remained where they had always been, and now so did everyone understanding of them.